Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. Don sitting in the host chair today. Seems strange because we haven't been sitting in host chairs a lot, we know, over the last few months. But as was mentioned in the recording that was released a couple of days ago, we're getting things back going again, and excited about having the team engaged and getting back in a regular rhythm here. When I say the team, I'm looking at some pretty cool people on my screen. Sadly, you can't see them, but you're going to get to hear them here. So moving around from my upper left. And I have to start there because, well, it's just a podcast tradition. It's like Cheers when Norm comes into the bar is what it's kind of like in my mind. That's with Mr. Chris Coppola. Chris, say hi to the good people.
Hi to the good people.
See, you can be away for a while, but home is always home. There's Dr. Eric Rush there on my moving around to my right. How are you tonight, Eric?
I'm doing great, Don. Great to be back.
Good to have you back. There's Eric Darling Bond in the lower center position. He's like an offset Paul Lynn from the Hollywood Squares when you don't have nine boxes. So Eric, say hi.
Well, hi, Don. It's good to be here.
Thank you. That was an unexpected surprise, but I will take it. And certainly last but not least, although he's the latest member of our team, it just feels so natural. We were talking off podcast just now with Dylan being part of the group because he fits in so well from a personality standpoint and a knowledge standpoint. So that would be Memphis's own Dylan Holzheimer. How you doing, Dylan?
I'm doing good, Don. It's always good to be back. It's a pleasure to see everybody again.
It is for me as well. So guys, I mentioned as we were doing the pre-work here, I'm dealing with being a little bit under the weather. My voice is not going to hold. So one of the great things I'm going to do for our listeners is I'm not going to talk much, which is probably would make every broadcast or every episode a little bit better. But I did want to do the intro here. We're going to do something we do incredibly well, I think, on A Fork in Time. That's either save or kill presidents. We are experts at this. You can bring anybody on who wants to try this. They ain't got nothing on the A Fork in Time Room Where It Happened team. And so today we're going to go off into that realm. And I guess we didn't talk about this off podcast, Eric, but you're probably the best one to give us the medical background here. And we're going to be talking about one James Garfield. And for those of you that don't know any better, we ain't talking about an orange cat. So there you go. Eric, take it away.
Yeah, so James Garfield was the 20th president of the United States. He was elected in 1880, and we'll get into a little bit about kind of the nature of his election, because there was actually some really interesting aspects of the Republican nomination for him. But he took office in 1881, and he died in 1881, so he was not president for very, very long. One of the things that he is really known for is his short term in office, and also the fact that he was assassinated. But he was assassinated after a long and unfortunately agonizing time after being shot. So at this point in American history, the presidents were generally sworn in on March the 4th. And so he had been president for a very short amount of time. And on July 2nd of 1881, he was shot twice. And he was shot by a person by the name of Charles Guiteau. And one of the bullets hit him in the arm, and that was a fairly superficial wound. And the other bullet hit him in the right part of the back part of his where his chest and his back met, so kind of in the side of his chest. And he was shot and it fractured his 11th right back rib. I have a couple of pictures, Don, anatomic pictures that we might include in the show notes, because there's a couple of pretty cool ones. And it went through his first lumbar vertebra. So, and I'll give a brief anatomy lesson to all the listeners. Is, we have very specific numbers of vertebra. We have 7 cervical vertebra in the neck. We have 12 thoracic vertebra in kind of the chest area. And we have 5 lumbar vertebra. And so the first lumbar vertebra in the upper back is where the bullet went through. And it went through kind of the front, or what we call the anterior portion of that vertebra. And it lodged in actually a surprisingly uninteresting place in the abdomen. And when it comes to bullets, you want uninteresting, because interesting usually means very quick death. But in his case, it lodged in an uninteresting part of the abdomen, or in kind of the abdomen, or what we would call kind of the border of the retroperitoneum, behind the pancreas and behind the spleen a little bit. And so it was just sort of hanging out there. It didn't hit any major blood vessels. It didn't perforate any major organs. He had a hole in his vertebra, which, I mean, let's be honest, none of us want that. He had a fractured rib, but fractured ribs can heal, and that's about it. And so he was shot, and we have now turned him over to the care of the physicians of 1881. And so I will turn it back to the group, and we will talk further. Probably, I don't know if you guys do we want to go back, now that we kind of know what happened on that day, do we want to go back to sort of how we got here?
I think that's a good idea, Eric.
Yeah, so let's do it.
So I woke up this morning at around 9:25. I'm sorry, Dylan, go ahead.
No, please. Your version's going to be much better than mine. I want to hear this.
No, you brought it up. You do it. I will keep my place.
So it was a balmy day sometime in the 1800s in what was then considered the mythical land of Ohio, where one James Allen Garfield was born. Fast forward several decades later, he is a prominent Ohio legislator, having served as a general in the Civil War. And he's begun to make a name for himself politically, but also kind of as a man of principle. Garfield is one of these incredible people you hear about but don't think actually exist. He was born in a log cabin, much like a more famous president that supposedly was born in a log cabin, Abraham Lincoln. And Garfield is this like polymath. He could famously write Latin in one hand, and because he also happened to be ambidextrous on top of all the other stuff, write Greek in the other hand. He went to seminary and then became a teacher for several years, was an attorney, and had this really kind of interesting political rise. He just in case anyone's ever on a trivia team, is the only, I believe still currently, sitting member of Congress who then ascended to the presidency. Technically, because he was actually elected to the Senate by the General Assembly, but he never took his seat because he got elected to the presidency in the interim before he became a senator.
Going to be a member of the House of Representatives. We
Correct,
have elected senators.
Yes, but the House of he was the only sitting House member, technically, because he hadn't gotten into a Senate seat yet. But he ends up becoming the president basically, as sort of a compromise candidate. Through a lot of the 1870s, there's a sort of theme of political patronage that kind of comes up, which is going to play into his assassination later. But this political patronage kind of becomes the sort of underlying question over who the candidate in the 1880 Republican presidential election is going to be. There was quite a popular contingent for former President Ulysses Grant. He was supported by sort of the political patronage supporters, the people who expected and had been for the last decade, been receiving appointments to various important and semi-important and self-important political positions as part of a new administration. These were known as the stalwarts, and their opponents, who favored sort of kind of an early version of the civil service merit system that we now know in the United States, were known as the half-breeds, which makes this sort of the weirdest, driest historical version of Greece that we could probably have ever imagined. But basically, the stalwarts are throwing their support either behind former President Grant or older brother and much less famous brother, John Sherman, who was William Tecumseh Sherman's brother. They were sort of the favored candidates of the stalwarts, whereas the half-breeds, were kind of trying to figure out who they wanted to get, but basically all they knew is they didn't want to satisfy Roscoe Conkling, who was the sort of Republican political matchmaker, sort of like a Republican version of Tammany up in New York, if you've ever heard of the Tammany Hall machine on the Democratic side. And essentially, Garfield always supported Sherman as kind of a candidate in opposition to the sort of Grant, cronyist kind of people. But they didn't actually want Grant. Too many G people in the 1800s Republican Party. This is going to be a problem. They didn't want Garfield himself to be a nominee. And it was only after, I think, the first or even the second ballot that they started to coalesce behind him as sort of an alternate candidate between Grant and Sherman and James G. Blaine, who may come up a little bit later in our discussions. He actually turned it down on the first ballot because he didn't want to be seen as sort of overturning his man. And then after a few more votes, the political sort of behind the scenes power brokering ended up coalescing behind Garfield, finally on the sort of final condition that he take on Chester A. Arthur as his vice president, who was from the sort of stalwart, more kind of political appointee faction. And that's sort of how Garfield kind of accidentally sort of ascended to the presidency as the best qualified man that everybody could agree on because they couldn't agree on anybody else. And then with that, do we want to take in maybe a little bit of a background into sort of his positions? Chris, Eric, do we want to do this?
I was going to do something just real quick there, Dylan. That was a really good summaries by everybody there. We intentionally avoid, as most of you know, being overly political on A Fork in Time. We do that for very intentional reasons. But it just struck me how things have not changed, that it took something extraordinary to actually get a qualified person to be who the nominee would be. It's just some things apparently have never changed. And, that just really struck me, is that it almost becomes this strange accident of a power struggle that leads people to go, well, he is qualified. So let's nominate him,
The other thing that comes to my mind here is this is a really interesting example of not to do the cabinet of rivals.
Yeah.
Because, you hear about William McKinley in 1900 brought in Teddy Roosevelt to, answer some questions about him. Eisenhower did it with Nixon. I mean, Reagan with Bush. This is something you do. You bring in somebody from another faction of your party to satisfy that wing and get elected. And when Garfield was shot, the assassin said, I am a stalwart and Chester A. Arthur will be president.
History repeats itself over and over and over, right?
Not so much. I think this is one of the only times that, unless you want to get early American presidency, where the runner-up was your vice president, where you got two members of the same party, a president. You said, Don, and let's put this out there for everybody. JFK is the one president that we don't want, that we will not kill off on this show. We won't go there. All those conspiracy theories aside, every other that has never happened. As often as you have two diametrically opposed groups within a party, this is the one time that it go ahead.
Point of order, Chris. I move to suggest that William Henry Harrison's VP and then President John Tyler was also pretty much opposed to everything of the party he had joined. He just didn't like Andrew Jackson personally.
And okay, so are you?
And that was a pretty disastrous.
No, but so are you trying to suggest here that the pneumonia bacteria that killed William Henry Harrison were working for him?
Yes.
Okay.
It's big plumbing.
Okay.
Well, right. I mean, the lobby for big bacteria has an agenda,
Okay.
Chris.
And
That's all.
actually, speaking of bacteria, that actually gives us a good way to transition into the assassination once
Back
again.
on the rails. Back on the
Yes.
rails.
yeah,
So-
very nicely done, Dylan. And so what we decided our fork was going to be is, and again, Eric Rush brings this specialization for us to the team and does it very well. Is around, I guess the best way I would know to describe it politely, Eric, would be that Garfield's going to get a better standard of care by not getting any care, is sort of what might be argued here. And as a result, we're going to keep Garfield alive, right?
Yeah. So, let's put the Wayback Machine, 150 odd years or 140 odd years. And, I get to be an old timey doctor, which, I've thought about would be kind of fun in some cases. And so with technology at the time, what I probably would have given him was some morphine, which some of his doctors did give him eventually. And I probably would have poured some, we'll say whiskey, but some sort of alcohol containing, agent on the wound itself. And I would have dressed the wound in a clean bandage, and I would have done nothing else. And so that's it, because really a lot of what the complications that Garfield had were due to the medical care he had at the time. And in fact, his assassin admitted to shooting him, but denied that he killed him, and suggested that it was actually Garfield's doctors that killed him. And he was not wrong. Like there was a good point to be made for that. And so there was, even with the technology at the time, there was a lot of things that we could have not done that probably hastened Garfield's death. So some things that we can think about. So he was given a big dose of quinine. Why? And so why was he given quinine? Quinine was an old anti-malarial. Well, quinine and related compounds do have a little bit of an anti-inflammatory effect. So those of us who lived through the pandemic will recall hydroxychloroquine, which is based on quinine, and we use that for a lot of autoimmune conditions. Okay, fine. So we get some quinine. He gets some morphine, which we would give him some sort of pain relief. Maybe it's morphine, maybe it's something different, but that's okay. He was given brandy, which probably we wouldn't give him in medical care today, but I understand why they did it. And he was given a dose of something called calomel. What is calomel? Calomel is mercurous chloride. And it was given for a lot of ails. As it turns out, mercury is really bad for you. And so that wasn't helping things. And then in addition, all of his doctors saw fit to probe his wound tract. So when he was shot, the overall tract of the wound was about 3.5 inches long. By the time he died, it was about 20 inches long and was gangrenous and oozing pus. And the reason why that was happening is because people were putting their fingers in there. So, for anybody who's listening, who's an aspiring medical professional, one of the first rules of medical care is don't put your dirty fingers in somebody's wound. That's bad. That's not going to turn out well for you. And so it was probed using people's fingers and and in some cases metal probes, but none of this was sterilized. None of this was done in a way that we would consider to be medically fit at that point. So there was a lot of things that were going on right now with Garfield that were not anywhere near what we would consider to be standard of care now. And I would argue, if you really looked at the kind of the top level care for 1881, I don't know that they were really standard of care for that time as well. Again, I think there's a case to be made that there were, people who were more versed on germ theory that would have done exactly what, I would have considered if I were the old timey doctor in that place, and give this poor guy give him some morphine to keep him comfortable, put some whiskey on the wound, dress it, leave him alone, and see what happens. He might have died. He might have still died because sometimes there is like infected cloth that goes into the wound, but his chances of survival were far, far better. And other Eric, you had a comment.
Thank you, other Eric. I just wanted to say that I've been keeping this in, waiting to release it at the right time. But you know what? If James Garfield had not chosen one of his friends, Dr. D.W. Bliss, to be his attending physician and had actually followed through on the merit-based system he kind of followed, he would have lived. Politics killed that man. If he was a true half-breed, he would have lived.
That and big bacteria.
And
That
big
and-
bacteria. Okay, so great point, Eric, because one of the things that Garfield and again, this isn't exactly political, but it's kind of political. One of the things that Garfield and his wife were very into was homeopathic medicine. So homeopathic medicine means not medicine. And so if he had really kind of listened to, kind of the prevailing voices at the time, again, maybe this would have been different. We had no antibiotics then. And, so we had no antibiotics. And so a lot of what medical care was being judicious about when you don't do anything at all. And to be honest, like there's a fair bit of medical care that is still that. And part of the training that we have is when do you recognize that a patient is going to heal themselves? And what you need to do is support them through that process.
I mean, the first thing, Eric, is do no harm, right?
Do no harm. That is, that is the tenet of the oath that we all took as physicians, is to do no harm. And, and sometimes to do no harm is to do nothing at all. And to explain to the patient why you are doing nothing at all, because you recognize that their body will heal itself. And that any intervention you have can only cause the potential for side effect, which none of us want to do.
So just to get us on to the historical what if here, which I've loved what we've done so far because it sets the stage very well and helps us, is that we are saying our fork is that he lives. Either by the old doc standard of care that Eric just outlined here, or we even talked about another possibility, which was some technology that could have come along that might have helped them realize where the bullet was and it could have stayed put. But for the purposes of what we're going to talk about on the historical what if here, we're going to assume that there is a Garfield administration that lasts beyond this very brief couple of months. And we're going to explore what the possibilities of that will look like and what the ripples are from that. So I'll throw it out for the panel. If you had to narrow down to the one big thing that you think might be different, what would that one big thing be? And I'll let whoever wants to go first jump up and go first. I see a hand from Eric the Thespian in Arizona.
Thank you, Don. So something I found out while doing research on James Garfield was that he was a radical Republican, meaning he was part of that Republican base that favored abolitionism. And he constantly wrote during Lincoln's presidency of like, well, he's the man for the job, but we could get better. He felt Lincoln didn't go far enough, especially in what the future plans were for Reconstruction. Now, during his very brief presidency, he said, I was probably a little too hard on Lincoln in terms of his political deftness and willingness to follow through. But James Garfield is one of those Republicans who is kind of in that transitional phase of post-Reconstruction that was ended by Rutherford B. Hayes to avoid Samuel J. Tilden becoming president. That was part of the deal they had made the prior election. And he was a big supporter of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a government agency to educate former slaves, so that way they were able to be self-sustaining outside of the Southern plantation system. When it got ended under Johnson, he spearheaded a campaign to provide universal public education. And this was his idea of a form of reparations for slavery, in that every former slave and their children will be able to get higher education free of cost. It will be handled by the federal government. That way, it would have avoided the worst excesses that we saw under Jim Crow and sharecropping, for instance. So I think in a campaign to where he is allowed to fully live out, maybe to 2 terms if possible, I think we could see universal education at least being started earlier on. The next year, in 1882, France is going to be providing the same educational program for all citizens, as long as it's not for non-laity or for the laity.
Right.
So what do you guys think?
So I think civil service reform is an interesting thing, but I'm curious if we would get it at the same pace that we would in our timeline, because it was a thing that Grant and Hayes had kind of brought up in the 1870s, but you have to kind of wonder if the sort of convenient timing of it finally passing almost immediately after Garfield's death, is relevant. So I think it civil service reform probably would have passed at some point, given how frequently it's been coming up across both Democratic and Republican administrations during this time. But I think the more immediate, I think it's kind of an eventuality at this point. But the Reconstruction, or sort of reconstruction, is potentially more of an immediate result of a Garfield, continuous presidency, because he, being a former educator, had, along with the universal education idea, had sort of different ideas of how to kind of enforce the reunionization of the South that some of his other party members weren't quite as on board with.
Certainly not Hayes.
Yes.
Certainly not Hayes.
Yeah, some of the ideas that Garfield and some of his kind of group had were, instead of to kind of ally themselves, because it's all sort of to a certain extent a game in the political side of things of, which factions can you get to back you when the next, election comes around. And historically, the Republicans had kind of sided after a certain point with some of the Democrats in the South in exchange for sort of letting the leash off a little bit and kind of looking the other way and relaxing some of their Reconstruction era policies. Garfield and some of his guys, especially along with the kind of concept of civil service reform, they did not like that idea. They instead preferred a kind of, industrial Reconstruction. So you have to wonder if Garfield would maybe try and be a little, more stringent on the sort of Reconstruction of the South, and instead, focus his energy instead of on, education, at least in the beginning, and civil service reform as kind of a industrial rehabilitation of the South, which makes you kind of wonder what would happen with cities like Atlanta and Montgomery and Birmingham and Memphis and places like that, where would you start to see this eventual, the Republicans of the 1880s and 90s are already kind of allied with sort of the capitalist machine anyway, in terms of the big corporations. But do you sort of see an early kind of almost like a pre-progressive movement in the Republican Party, where they use the sort of, hey, we're inspiring, the capitalists and the industrialists to sort of help lift, the freed slaves and the poor, underclass of sort of the post-war South into kind of a sort of progressive idea, instead of this sort of kind of malaise of the late Gilded Age. I'm curious if had Garfield had more political continuity and clout, had he been able to kind of get something like that off the ground. What do you guys think?
I just don't see. I think Garfield was there. I don't see in the Republican Party, I don't see in the nation the will to keep on the recalcitrant Confederates. I don't see the will to restart Reconstruction.
I see where you're coming from, Chris, and I agree to a point, but I think it's a question of how long does Garfield have? So if we are, if we're a month, then no. I mean, like that was the problem. But let's assume a 2-term presidency, and he has 7.5 years. So he has a bully pulpit for a long time. Do I think he's going to completely kind of recapture the Reconstruction? Absolutely not. But could he use that bully pulpit to, pick out very specific examples of where Reconstruction was particularly beneficial? Maybe. And
the other thing I'm
that?
thinking about is I think he may very, very well be able to at least stop the sliding.
Yeah, I think that's right. Right.
He would be able to use the legal and constitutional framework that was built under Reconstruction, because we talk, that you talk about Jim Crow. This is when those state laws were passed. So even in his one term, Arthur appointed 2 Supreme Court justices. Those 2 justices, and I'm hope Dylan will correct me if I'm wrong. How did they vote on Plessy Ferguson? Because that's right around now.
Actually, I think if I remember the appointments correctly, at least one of them had already died by the time Plessy came down.
Okay.
So it kind of comes out at a wash. But just as far as that idea goes, I think just as that specific case, I don't think it really moves the needle. I think that's going to kind of the separate but equal doctrine, because of the sort of entrenched nature of the Supreme Court in terms of its political variance over time. I think that specific court case is going to kind of be what it is, but it's sort of the context that surrounds it may be sort of the different view.
Yeah, I'm not even sure, because I feel like this is that period immediately after Reconstruction when a lot of the groundwork for those arguments was being laid. And if it is stopped there, you may not have the kind of backsliding you did.
Yeah, I mean, Plessy versus Ferguson was not a close run case. It was a 7-2, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
I don't know.
The other thing to consider is, oh, sorry, Eric. I was just going to say the other thing to consider was Garfield also wanted to bring more African Americans into the federal government, which he would have the home field advantage on being able to appoint them. So that's another interesting case to see, like, well, who would have been appointed? Would it be someone like Robert Smalls, for instance, who had like a legendary career as one of the first African Americans, an escaped slave, to become a congressman for several terms?
Yeah.
For instance, just for at the top of my head. But I think there is one key issue that might kill James Garfield's chance for a second term. The Chinese Exclusionary Act, which everybody wanted except James Garfield.
So
at that time,
Eric, talk to us about that, because and this is one of those instances where we have a person like James Garfield who is in many cases quite progressive, but in whom there is some 7-1 because there was an abstention. That's right. Thank you, Don. Who is quite progressive in a lot of ways, but who made some decisions that to our modern ears are very problematic.
Right. So this would happen during Arthur's presidency in our timeline. Basically, the Chinese Exclusionary Act was the idea that we would put a hard limit on any Chinese immigration into the U.S. At that time, Chinese labor was seen as being very cheap and easily affordable. Again, the sort of thing that happens when there's not a minimum wage and you can just keep saying, like, okay, well, I'll bring in this group of immigrants and they'll be willing to be paid for less because they don't know better. It happens frequently in the cycles of American history. And so became a popular rallying cry of, well, we can't have cheap labor keep coming in and taking the market from born Americans. I believe this was also a tenet of nativism, but I had to stop myself before I said Native American because Garfield had very dark feelings about that. But going back to Chinese exclusion, Garfield was one of the few who, as much as he could say publicly, wasn't comfortable with the idea because he felt doing so would endanger missionaries in China and felt that we have to allow Chinese immigration to go unimpeded because it helps the missionaries convert them to Methodism or other branches of Christianity, but Methodism was his preferred brand. And as soon as he dies, pretty much everybody says, can we do the Chinese Exclusionary Act? And the next year, 1882, it gets passed under Chester Arthur.
I'm glad you raised that issue, Eric, because it always is fascinating to me. It actually ties back to what happens that leads to his death for the other Eric. This clicked in my head, which is why I think it's relevant. Is the reason those physicians probably chose not to do something was they felt like they needed to do something. There's that desire typically to want to do something, right? Even if, just to have done something. And it what Eric DB just mentioned, there was this concept I think we often overlook when we're doing the alternate history. We begin to wonder what would have happened, meaning what, to again the idea even earlier when Eric and Chris, when you guys were talking about slowing the descent or changing the direction. It's this idea sometimes of what Garfield would have done by just being there would have prevented something that everybody else. It's the negation impact of what's there that I think it's often very easy to overlook because we start looking for what would have proactively be done when we start talking about alternative timelines, and it's easy to forget what happened that probably would not have happened just because of that negation effect. And again, I can't help but think that the irony of turning back to, first of all, do no harm. First of all, do nothing. It's sort of the alternate history version of that is that it's not just what does happen as in an alternate timeline. It's what was not prevented from happening, I guess is the point. Chris, you're nodding. Do you have something you want to say to that?
Not necessarily. I do like, I think it's important to talk about what Eric was saying. Just to kind of put it all together, though, we're saying Garfield is actually on the right side of the Chinese Exclusion Act. He doesn't necessarily have he's the right side, but for reasons that at least
Right.
I personally find a little objectionable. But I'll take a win where I can get it, especially when, every single other, as you were pointing out, and I agree with this, political power was saying, yeah, we need to keep them out. And then, what am I going to have on Christmas? But so getting back to the point here, and you did touch on something. Yeah, I wish you could see Eric Bond's face because it just hit him. So you mentioned a little bit about Native American policy. What is Garfield's stance on that? What is Arthur's, and what are some deltas here? What are some changes that this could bring about?
I don't know if it's necessarily changes, but Garfield was very anti-Native American. You might find that hard to believe. He lives in Ohio. Or he grew up in Ohio and very much was about extermination of Native Americans. He felt that it wasn't possible to do, but he felt that if they're going to be here, they should assimilate. And what we see later in the Dawes Act in the 1890s, where so in what was called Indian Territory, or the majority of Oklahoma today, it was mostly administered by the 5 civilized tribes: Chickasaw, Choctaw, was it Cherokee?
Cherokee were definitely, yeah.
Yeah. What were the other two? for the 5, but essentially
Seminoles and Creek.
Seminoles and Creek. Thank you, Chris.
Seminole and Creek, that's right.
So what happened under the Dawes Act, which was also sponsored by, I want to say, future Vice President Curtis, who himself was half Native, was that instead of having public lands, which would be used by the different tribes, they would have an allotment given to each family group. Kind of like what we saw with public land in England during the Middle Ages, to where it now is fully under the federal government for them to allot. And this was a policy favored by James Garfield of no more communal land. Everything is either somebody's or it's the government's, and never the two shall meet except with a little bit of money. Now, this was his policy. Also, when he was in recovery or slowly dying, however we want to describe it, they had captured Sitting Bull, and they told him, like, oh, he's starving. And he says, let him starve. No, wait, send him the porridge. Because Garfield hated porridge and couldn't keep it down, which also led to some other interesting medical procedures that people can look up on their own time. So if Garfield's around, it might lead to an earlier enactment to which that land is then divided and then given.
So just one clarification. What state was Charles Curtis from?
Wasn't he from Oklahoma?
Kansas. Just as a Kansas boy.
You're just saying, Eric, right? You're just saying.
He was, and so Charles Curtis, born Topeka, Kansas, same as me. Anyway, he's so he is a pride of the city and the state.
And what's your stance on Herbert Hoover?
Well, so we've talked about
Herbert Hoover was from Iowa, so he's a Midwesterner, but I'm still not yeah.
So
we're getting too political. I probably shouldn't have said anything, but when somebody from Kansas comes up,
no,
I gotta rep from Kansas.
Look, all I can say is I'm glad we don't apparently have anybody born in Nebraska on this podcast, or things can get very dangerous very quickly.
I lived in Nebraska for a number of years, Dylan, but I'm not from Nebraska. I'm from Kansas.
So I think, we've talked about a couple of, we've talked a lot about the home front, but I'm curious, and the Chinese Exclusion Act is kind of, you can debate whether that's kind of, domestic policy or foreign policy, because it's a little bit of both, but we haven't really talked about, what would, foreign policy look like in the event of this kind of extended Garfield presidency, the Garfield cinematic universe, as it were, because this is kind of an interesting period in, sort of the real, not just the American real life timeline, but also just the general world timeline. But, in America, this is kind of seen as sort of, kind of our coming out period, or like, this is our awkward, we're starting to get a growth spurt and we're finally busting out the braces and then getting out of them, where we come out as the cool high school kid in the 19 teens. And, in Europe, this is the period where nations are forming. Germany forms in 1871, Italy forms a couple years before that. So this is a very kind of interesting time in the foreign policy realm. And I'm curious, especially Chris, I know you tend to love the foreign policy front. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, what the world might look like, differently in foreign policy from the perspective of, sort of what happens to other countries besides just what we deal internally if Garfield has another 3 or 7 years.
So there's one interesting point that Garfield is trying to build kind of an inter-American. As I understand it, we're not sure what it is. It's a closeness. He's improving inter-American relations, whether that means a free trade, whether that means some strengthening of the Monroe Doctrine. It's not quite clear. That is completely dropped that is one of those big ideas he's trying to get done that just falls apart as soon as he's assassinated.
Yeah, and I think that's, because there's especially some of the other people that are around him, they're a little bit more clear on what they intend. I think Blaine at one point outright uses the word annexation in certain correspondence, not necessarily geographic conversation, but the idea of sort of trade annexation. But that idea of like a sort of Pan-American trade zone is really kind of interesting because it's not something you really start seeing again until sort of post World War II with sort of the rebuilding of the Allies in the United Nations. And, I think it's kind of curious, I wonder what would have happened to, say, the Spanish American War or some of the stuff in the Caribbean if, a Garfield, Blaine sort of whatever their intentions actually were of some kind of economic
the
sort
one
of
thing
linkage had.
The one thing I'd point out is I feel like Garfield is approaching it from a different power dynamic. The United States is absolutely involved in Latin America straight through the whole period. Just ask Haiti how that worked out for them. I'm pretty sure the United States Marines occupied Haiti for the majority of this time period between the Spanish American War and the end of World War II. Blaine, and I will say Blaine, because I do agree that it was a lot of Blaine's ideas that you hear about the domestic president having vice president's going to handle my foreign policy. I think he's outsourcing a lot of his foreign policy to Blaine, and I think one of the things Blaine is doing is building a distinctively cooperative structure as opposed to the power structure that does come into play of interventionism, of annexations, of very much the United States going in and dictating terms. We want to invite the republics of Latin America to discuss this and develop something mutually rather than we want them to sign on this dotted line.
So, Chris, do you think that there's something? Again, I sort of agree with what Eric said earlier. You're my go-to guy when I normally think foreign policy. Normally when I think Europe, particularly in a situation like this, particularly this time in Europe, because we spent a lot of time in the late 19th century in Europe for all kinds of reasons. Is the change limited to what sort of Dylan referred to here, being more this Pan-American, this different idea, at least economically, if not anything else, to the Western Hemisphere, or do we see a different America interacting with the events that are going on elsewhere in the world? Because as was mentioned earlier, there's a lot of stuff going on in Europe and the rest of the world during this particular time frame. And my take and memory of most of American history as it comes to there is we're not involved in that because we're busy dealing with what we're dealing with here.
So I don't think the United States has any change in, for example, the Berlin Conference, which is happening about this time, that deals with a lot of Balkan stuff that I am not going to get into. The one thing I will say, and I think this is important to think about, is the relationship of the British Empire to the Monroe Doctrine. There were discussions when the Monroe Doctrine, and by the way, yes, it was launched, 60 years before we're talking about right now, but there were negotiations when the United States was going to promulgate the Monroe Doctrine that we would do it in concert with the British, because the goal of the Monroe Doctrine initially was to stop the expansion or the recolonization of Latin American republics. It had nothing to do with Cuba, Puerto Rico, any nation, any territory that was still European. It was just to preserve the independence of the nations that were independent in 1820. And the reason both the United States and Great Britain liked that is because we liked being able to trade with them. As long as they were independent, we could trade with them. We just did not want any kind of political arrangements which would prejudice our ability to deal with them. Now, here's where I'm going with this. If the United States starts building a free trade area with these Latin American republics, what does that explicitly do? Prejudice British trade with these Latin American republics. Dylan, you seem really happy about you. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think you're building up to something that I was kind of wanting to go. It's in a different
Okay.
geographic ballpark, but it's in
Okay.
the same kind of political ballpark.
Yeah, throw it.
So, you're building towards a kind of economic tension, at least in some sense, between the United States and Britain. And at this time, we're talking kind of south of the United States, but if you think about what Britain is doing at this time and where all the other major colonial powers are, the last place on Earth you can really, besides Antarctica and the poles, but that comes decades later. The last place you can really look for your place in the sun in this time period is in the Pacific. And there's one very large kingdom that is currently kind of up for grabs in this time period. It's sort of nominally affiliated with the United Kingdom, but both the United States and also the Germans have expressed some interest in and around sort of the area of, Hawaii and Samoa and some of those outlying islands. So if you factor in that,
let's just be perfectly clear. By the way, there was another little thing that came up at another point. Hawaii and Samoa are about as far apart as Lisbon and Moscow, if not further. But just square mileage wise. But
mileage wise. But to be fair, when you're in the blue canvas of the Pacific, you'll take any green dot you can get.
Yeah.
Especially once you start getting into the age where you've got naval power projection becomes more the thing. But if you think of the fact that if the United States does get this sort of Latin American economic bloc that puts pressure, especially if they can get sort of an early Panama Canal, which was one of the things that had at least been floated, if not necessarily seriously discussed. That gives the United States a Western Hemisphere huge economic edge over what is then the largest empire on which the world never sets. So, me personally, I get kind of curious as to once you start seeing the early chess moves of what's eventually going to lead up into the situation that sort of locks in the First World War, I'm really curious where some of these early potential dominoes kind of create situations that set up later. In terms of if you've got a United States that's more economically flexing its muscle, and Britain is starting to worry not just about what's happening on the continent, but as far as their pocketbook goes, what's happening across the pond. What does that do to the sort of global, diplomatic poker table?
I think the one reason I was interested in thinking about the British relationship with South America is because they actually have the ability to do something. France, Germany, Russia, all of, I'll throw Austria-Hungary into it too. Why not? Italy as well have absolutely no ability whatsoever to do anything in the Western Hemisphere without at least the acquiescence of both the United States and Great Britain. Spain as well. So I think the interesting thing is if you have competition between the United States and Great Britain, instead of them, we're not necessarily working together, but we have the same goal. If you don't have that, maybe the entire Western Hemisphere does become more of an Africa, more of an area where, one, you see scrambling, two, Germany explicitly wants colonies. So maybe you see you probably see the United States cooperating with Germany and supporting some of their colonial adventurism. So maybe you have, and I know you're probably thinking about German Germany taking over, for example, some Spanish possessions. Or, by the way, just to put this out there, once you crack the shell of the Western Hemisphere and have people playing over here, there's nothing to say you don't have more, for example, Maximilian, people coming over here trying to install their own personal, there's a lot of lobbies, there's a lot of big organizations we're talking about, and I want to harken back to probably one of my favorite episodes with the Lime Lobby, where we talk about when the United States was distracted, the huge violation of the Monroe Doctrine. But once you have the United States and Great Britain possibly competing, it's a lot easier for some of these smaller for I can't believe I just called the German Empire a smaller country, but maybe these countries that don't have the power projection capabilities.
And the power projection, Chris, is about, another thing that ties back to Garfield and how things might have been different in a Garfield extended administration, which is, one of the things that, we get these wonderful pre-show notes that Eric Darling Bond prepares for this that are fantastic, that help more or less keep us on track. We can't stay there, but they at least tell us there is a track that we ought to sort of follow or think about. But that one of the things that he mentioned in there, one of Garfield's positions is the U.S. Navy ain't nothing to write home about when Garfield is elected. And he wants to do something about that. Now, eventually there will be the build of a Navy that enables the U.S. to be in a position by the Spanish-American War to project force. But the key to projecting force then, just as the key to projecting force now on a global basis, is the ability to do it over the big blue part that Dylan mentioned earlier, whichever blue part you're talking about. You have to have a Navy in order to be able to do that, particularly if you're doing it from the Western Hemisphere. And so, is the growth because of the very things you're talking about there, Chris? And we've already mentioned here, protecting economic interest in the hemisphere, giving some backbone to revitalize protection of the concepts of the Monroe Doctrine. And by the way, you already mentioned who you're doing that in contest with. It ain't quite what it used to be, but Britannia still cares about the waves. And so what is that? How does that play out? Does that mean Garfield suddenly needs to even be more of an advocate for a Navy that happens even faster? And so you now have the capability that allows you to do things, or because you need to do things, you build the capability, chicken or egg, whichever comes first.
Or to get a little bit further down the road here, the United States, because we are not trying to build prejudicial economic relationships with Latin America, Britain looks at both Garfield and Arthur rebuilding the American Navy as, well, these are just ships that'll basically be on our side anyway, so we don't really need to worry about them. If there's an adversarial relationship, I mean, the first episode I ever did focused largely on the Anglo-German naval competition. If Great Britain sees the United States as a threat, maybe they do see and they do develop that naval competition instead of with Germany, with the United States. I don't think the United States is involved in European politics, but what you would have is the Spanish Empire would probably wind up in somebody else's hands, period. I think if Britain is already angry at the United States and is conflicted with that, they would support a German annexation of Cuba and Puerto Rico explicitly to prevent them from falling into the hands of the United States. If you look at British colonial history, very rarely do they go out and try and take something. It just kind of falls into their hands. The British view is they have a very accidental empire, and they'd be very happy letting some Caribbean islands go to Germany. Well, how does that change? What does that change? And by the way, do you even, my God, Don, I think we might have prevented the world wars.
We can't do that. You've told us that's impossible, Chris.
I think I have a way to counter you, Chris.
Okay, no, please.
So taking your setup, we have sort of an opposition, say the United States, instead of getting, Cuba and Puerto Rico from the Spanish, the Germans get it with help from British intervention. Well, that then leads to Britain and Germany being, if not necessarily friendly, at least recognizing that they have kind of political interests in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And the United States left out in the dust. Well, both
Or the
Britain,
United States aligned with France, by the way, because that's the natural.
that's really what I was getting to. Because you have they're the one historical enemy of both Britain and Germany, and the one historical ally of the United States. So now, instead of the United States sitting on the sidelines and Germany having to figure out how to take on Britain and France on one side and Russia on the other, you have both France and the United Kingdom sandwiched. You've got the UK being sandwiched between the US and France, Germany being sandwiched between France and Russia, and the UK and Germany are allies, which makes it much.
I by the way think I really like what you're going. I think I misspoke when I said we're preventing it. What I said really meant is we're changing the very power dynamics of it, and I think maybe the First World War looks a little bit more like what Winston Churchill actually said should be referred to as the First World War or the 7 Years' War, which I will never. I will dig in my heels and I will never refer to it as a French and Indian War, but it is the 7 Years' War, where you had Britain fighting in the colonial world against France and now the United States, and a united Germany, which its core was Prussia, fighting on the continent with economic and financial support from Great Britain.
We always find a way to screw up World War I somehow.
Yeah. Well, and by the way, just I think we were at least, if I'm being perfectly honest, as maybe I'm not a typical American history student, but just at least in my looking at my recollection of American history, okay, the Civil War ends, and then there's the Gilded Age, like William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, and things start up. I mean, the presidents here, okay, yeah, it's Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland. My God, I'm even drawing a blank on who comes after that. There's gaps. There's this large gap where, at least in American politics, kind of the power had ebbed back to Congress, and the president was a little bit more of a caretaker. And there's almost this kind of like, okay, yeah, and that, and that, and that. And I'll be honest, I doubt most people, other than Chester A. Arthur's, and we did talk about this a little bit, world class mutton chops. The average American could not pick any of these presidents out of a lineup.
In fact, the only reason the average American, I would argue, sadly knows these names is there might be a high school named after one of them that they don't even understand why that is.
Either that or
you guys really mean it's because of the Stephen Sondheim musical masterpiece Assassins that anyone even talks about this period.
Nope. The real reason is Die Hard with a Vengeance.
I don't even know if I want to explore that.
No, they do explicitly talk about this in Die Hard with a Vengeance, right?
You got to let us know.
Yes. No, they do. There's basically a bomb at a high school, and there's this random dump truck driver in an aqueduct in New York, and he knows that Chester A. Arthur was the 21st president. He tells John McClane this, and that's how he knows where the bomb is, so he can go find and save the day from the bad guys. It's Die Hard 3.
There you go.
Die Hard with a Vengeance.
So I'm going to try to bring us to some logical soft landing here. And I've enjoyed where we've gone around, how we've circled everything, but we probably could go on and we would enjoy it for maybe a couple more hours. I don't know our listeners would. But what we sort of came to there that popped into my head that maybe a way to put this all together, talking about how non-memorable, basically there's Lincoln, there's, there's
Johnson the
Grant.
first.
Well,
Oh.
there's Andrew Johnson. There's Grant, because Grant's more famous because he was a general than he was because he was a president, kind of thing. Andrew Johnson because he's impeached. But then there's that long line of late 19th century American presidents that, unless you've memorized the order or you're just, you're like us, you're die hard when you come to this, it. It's and then see where I went there, Chris. But then it's like, basically it's Lincoln, Roosevelt, and then there's whatever happened in between, right? That's the
Grant.
typical.
It was like 30 years of Grant.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason I bring that up, I think it ties us all the way back to one of the things we talked about early on was the qualifications of this guy named Garfield. This was a guy who had real bona fides, intellect, other things that were there, you know, the makings of someone given the right break of circumstance in history. And that's part of what we've been talking about, is how would history have been the same or different here, right? Is that there's a chance that Garfield is remembered because of what he did in being Garfield. And that's lost because there's never the Garfield presidency. And so this idea of this, string of, like you said, 30 years of Grant kind of thing, I think that's a great way to describe it, gets broke in the alternate timeline, gets broken by the fact that there's 4 to 8 years of Garfield. And that's substantial, not knowing exactly what it would be. We've talked about some of the possibilities here, not knowing exactly what it would be, but that's substantial compared to the real timeline where it's, again, if you ask the average American who is Garfield, more of them are likely to refer to a cartoon cat than they are a president. That's just the simple reality of what that name associates.
I think this is a good example of the negative, the negation aspect you were talking about earlier. Because of this president, who's the second shortest ever in office, we found a way to fundamentally change the founding event of the 20th century and then everything that goes after that, just from his not being there.
Right. You've heard me say so many times, one of the things I've learned through doing the podcast here that I knew, somehow had lost track of it, got reminded of it, and now understand it even more. I no longer in my head think of World War I and World War II as being two separate, distinct historical events. I think of them, rightfully so, I believe, as being a link. The 100 Years' War, for example, was a series of conflicts, with the same over a period of time. We might as well, there was the 20th century World War, essentially, is what there was. Because we've talked so many times about World War II coming out of the end of World War I and what happens there. There's this just interesting peace period in the middle, quasi peace period. But you're right. If you change the late 19th century, you set up a different board for the start of the 20th century.
And again, change somebody that no Americans know about, just nobody recognizes. Yeah. I mean, I remain convinced the reason they use that in the movie is because it is just so obscure.
Right. I agree. And, to me, that's why I enjoy doing the podcast, other than the fact, I've met good people and enjoy the conversations around this, is I suddenly start thinking about what I had never thought about before. I had not given much thought to the Garfield presidency. Period. Just period. And I think of myself as being a student of history. And even when I saw the topic suggestion today, I'm like, okay, the Garfield presidency. Yeah, okay, that's fine. That sounds good. Everybody seems gung-ho for that, which is great. So I learned things, again, because of raising the question of if somebody doesn't stick their finger in a gunshot and, and decides that brandy's as good as anything else you might do otherwise, we can have a very different America and a very different world today because of, back to the original concept here, somebody just didn't do a little, current best of care practice, physicianing during that period of time that's there. Did I do an okay job of summarizing that, maybe, guys?
No, that was perfect, Don.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts before we close out?
Just maybe the brandy would have done more good on the instruments than on the president.
I am going to agree with you on that, Chris.
I would just like to point out that by keeping Garfield alive, we arguably rectify the greatest sin of American politics, and that is the disappearance of facial hair from the American president.
Yes.
Because Garfield and Blaine and those guys have some of the greatest facial hair that you can ever see in a president. You know, Arthur, the mutton chops were great for Arthur, but between Arthur and the sort of desperate mustached gasp of Teddy Roosevelt, we really have not had a good presidential facial hair since James Garfield. And I think in this timeline,
You're
you
seeing
can
this
picture
as a podcast, which I would say 80% of the men on this podcast are facial haired. And so all I'm going to say is, Chris, throw your razor away, man.
Honestly, that's just because I have very bad lighting. I have the Nixon 1960 going here.
So Chris has some very fashionable stubble, but the rest of us have like frank beards.
Yeah.
So let's bring it back. Let's bring it back.
There you go. Guys, I want to say thanks again. It's good to get things going again. We appreciate our listeners who have been sticking through us or to it. I think a lot of people have still found the podcast and wondering why did it stop. So they'll be maybe happily pleased to see, because we still see the downloads, which suggests there's new people coming, but they haven't seen anything new, haven't seen much new for a while. So I appreciate that. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the co-founder of the podcast, and Eric, I'll get to you in just a second. That's Alexis, who couldn't join us tonight. I think we've mentioned this before. I think most of our listeners may know, if they're loyal listeners, she's expecting during the month of October. That's part of the reason she's not joining us tonight. She reminded me in a text while we were recording here that she's going to the website because she needs to go buy some onesies for the baby that's coming, that are Fork in Time onesies. So I just throw that out there. We don't shill our stuff, we don't shill our merch or talk much about that. But if you need some Fork in Time merchandise, or you want to rep the show a little bit, we go all the way from mugs and coffee tumblers, and actually some really cool. I'm actually going to be ordering for this fall. There's a really cool Fork in Time football jersey. If you haven't gone to the site and checked that out, that's pretty cool, I think. But even if you need some baby apparel, we know that because a baby's coming that definitely is going to be connected to the podcast. So just mention that. And then the other things you could also do at our website, which is to give us some feedback and reviews and suggestions. We have a whole queue of topics, but that doesn't mean we don't bump topics down when better ones come in, because we're always looking for what we think our listeners will be interested in. And of course, you can find the whole back catalog there and everything else that goes on that. Don't feel obligated, but if you do feel so inclined, the ability to support us there through Patreon or supporting us through the store. We don't make a lot there, but those proceeds do go back into the podcast and keeping things up and going. And I've said this before, I will say it again, because it's been long enough for me. If it hasn't been long enough for you as a listener who's just cycling through and gorging podcast episodes back to back here, not realizing the time that goes between. When Alexis and I started this exercise, we thought it was going to be fun for us, and we may find some people that were out there. I did not imagine I would get introduced to people that I did not even know them, that I really enjoy the way that I do. And that's so one of the things about Fork in Time and the room where it happened, because that's going to be coming back strong in October as well, is that I found like-minded people who know more about history, a lot of history than I do, and are willing to talk about it. And that's a pretty cool place. Anybody have any other closing thoughts?
I just wanted to say,
I'm sorry.
We've created a timeline in which there is no Garfield the comic. It is just called John. The original title given by Jim Davis. It just stays John.
It just stays John, and probably is a far less interesting world as a result of that. But we'll see how that goes. So, guys, again, I appreciate you. Wishing all of our listeners out there not just a good listen to this, but good things that are going on in their life, whatever they might will be. Alexis isn't here to throw to, so I'm going to throw to Dylan. Dylan gets some of the newcomer thing. We have this little thing that we do at the end of each episode where we suggest that if our listeners happen upon a fork in time, do we have any advice for them, Dylan?
Yes, take it.
All right, take it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.